Going. We're live. Welcome back, guys. This week we are going over C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves. I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to Landon for the synopsis.
All right, so in the intro, he lays out the idea of need love and gift love. And you can think of need love as like a child running to its mother. Like the child needs to be taken care of by his mother and relies on the gifts the mother has to give. He needs the gifts, right? But the gift love is divine love, right? And that's things that you just kind of have intrinsically. Like the things that you're most passionate about and just intrinsically willing to work towards and strive towards. But then in chapter 2, he lays out the idea of kind of like the lower stratus of love, which is pleasure, and he lays out the not quite the antithesis, but the like the more diluted forms of those loves, which are need pleasure and appreciation pleasure. And need pleasure is simply put like more of like an addiction. Like you could think of the fact that you need food and water to survive as a sort of addiction. You have thirst, and then the pleasure that you get from drinking water is reliant on that experience of thirst, and same with food. And then with appreciation pleasure, that's something that you get just like aesthetically through nature and just through the kind of pleasure that life can bring to you, but it's not quite love yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because he says with what was the second one? It was appreciation pleasure. He says that there's two types. There's aesthetic, and then there's like natural. And so he kind of he differentiates those by saying, for example, the aesthetic pleasure would be you drink a very nice glass of wine, and you're like a wine connoisseur, and so it's taken you years and years to build up that skill, and so you can appreciate that wine because you've built up that skill. So that would be like the aesthetic uh, kind of pleasure versus the kind of natural pleasure, which was his example was walking by a bean field and you smell kind of the smell of the beans kind of waft off the field. And it's just like such a sweet smell, and you're just in awe because of the beauty of like the field itself and the smell, and it's just a very beautiful scene. Um, I just found that interesting that he differentiates the two of those, but still kind of keeps them under the same heading of appreciation pleasure.
Yeah, because he talks about how we kind of like brutalize language. The word love is kind of cliched and overused in the same way that God is, and so it takes someone to work through these ideas and organize all the different aspects of love that there are, because we might not necessarily know what we're talking about when we say the word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because love and the examples you give, love and God, they're so packed full of like meaning and like psychological charge that like you said, they take the form of many things, so that's why they're so cliched, because people can just use them freely, or dare I say carelessly, in many contexts, and not necessarily attempt to address like, well, what is this form of love, or what is this expression of God that I'm experiencing or hearing. So yeah, what he's doing essentially in the general premise of this book is this is the process of coming to understand the different aspects of love and like its many forms.
Mhm.
And something that I noted in the introduction, which I think is important before we talk too much about the pleasures, is he talks about the necessity of need love, because need love obviously is a necessity. It's a foundation in developing a higher spirituality, and this goes hand in hand with what he says, saying that, and this is one of my favorite things he said in the book so far, is because it rings true of so many different ideas I've learned, even with something regarding Carl Jung, is that the highest cannot stand without the lowest. He said he quotes that because if you were to look at something like a plant, it stands it, as tall as it will stand. It has roots under there that are embedded in the soil, and the roots are dirty and grubby. And that's kind of just a parallel to this aspect of like aesthetics, or I guess like the beautification of love versus like need love, where need love is something that you can kind of discard because it's such a basic like um,
Mhm.
embedded idea in our lives that you kind of can take it for granted, I think. And so,
Yeah. Well, so
yeah.
he kind of to expound on what you're saying, um, while he's kind of like telling about these different loves, he's also detailing how how they can be corrupted and like how they can go wrong. And so, kind of like you were saying, it, need love is kind of looked down on because people often think of like gluttony or lust or things along those lines, because that's how need love can kind of go wrong. It's also kind of like the Oedipal complex would be an example of a need love. Um,
Well, it's like if
but
you take the example of like psychological inquiries, like if you look at um, psychotherapists and their practices when they discuss things with clients, like the foundations of the family, and this was like very like a Freudian, well, even in just a general psychotherapeutic concept that you have to assess like the faults in your foundations before you
mhm,
can ascend to anything, before you can move on to assessing like greater things like your you have to address something like your family trauma before you move on to like becoming more individuated, for example. But yeah, so they're like they can be neglected, or it's like can be the toughest thing for someone to face because it's so like embedded within your younger mind, and it's like it can be buried and repressed over so many years. But
mhm.
sorry to interrupt you on that, but continue.
Very good. I was just going to go on to say that he, kind of like you were saying, he goes on to say, uh, his initial reaction to need love was that it was like a negative thing,
Mm-hmm.
um, to the point where he was actually, when writing this, thinking about not even saying it was love, like labeling it as something else entirely.
Mm-hmm.
But then he kind of thought about it, and said that there is something kind of true about need love, especially when you consider the fact that all love of God is need love, because um, it's not gift love in the sense that it's charitable or protective or something like that. It is like looking to a higher power for consolation
Yeah.
in the world.
Right,
Um,
because what are you going to give to God? God, he doesn't need anything you have to give. So you're fundamentally in a relationship with him of almost begging him for mercy, which is, I think, a lot of flack that the Christian church got, preaching of hellfire and just bowing down before God, and that preaching fear of God.
mhm.
A lot of people understand that idea because it puts you in a that's not a good state to be in. People don't typically want to be that vulnerable. But fundamentally, what he's getting at is humans are needful creatures, and we need and we ask and ask and ask, and it's like God's really the only thing that can give you what you need to both survive and to strive spiritually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I think about people who say they need God, right? People who say they need God in their life, and without God, they wouldn't be able to get through certain things. And I resonate with that. I've never quite understood people who say they don't need God or need some higher power. Because, and it's interesting that people are always converted at like their darkest moments, right? Their moments of greatest suffering when we really need something beyond ourselves.
Well, look at AA. It's a great example. There's AA, and then there's the Johns Hopkins studies on psilocybin and how that relates to alcoholism. The aspect of that was crucial for there to be the conversion out of alcoholism was a mystical experience. The having a framework where there's a higher intelligence governing both your life and the entire universe is a necessity for, I think, most people. In my opinion, it's kind of naive to think that you can just go without that. Like that's quite the feat to think that you're the master here. You know, you're sailing your own boat on this in this life. It's crazy.
I think it's funny because I have always thought that it is easier to be a Christian than it is to be an atheist. Like, I find it difficult to believe that there is nothing out there. And I find it difficult to believe that other people believe that there's nothing out there. Because it's such, to me, that is more of a leap of faith than Christianity. Because to believe that there's nothing, you have to accept that your life is kind of inherently without value. And that is incredibly tough to like, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's hard to argue against, but it is much easier in the sense that you're kind of, with Christianity, you're kind of handed your meaning on a platter. It's like God is here, your life is inherently meaningful, and you don't really have to work for it that hard. With atheism, you kind of, you have to pull some kind of logical loops there to really find meaning.
Well, I think it's interesting, and I think when you take this idea that, you know, because I believe that is a fundamental like aspect of healthy human psychology to understand yourself, what it may be, is not what I'm necessarily saying, but the fact that you are subjected to something divine and something at least above yourself. You know, even with, you take someone like Nietzsche, who his main premise was to try to, you know, enforce like this will for life in the face of like absolute chaos, but at the same time he had a like a solace in like the metaphysical principle of art. That's what we talked about in The Birth of Tragedy. You know, he quoted in Zarathustra that without music, life is meaningless. He has this he still has this intimation of something that extends beyond his capacity for understanding it. And I think that again, that's even with someone like Sam Harris, he in all of his like his rational ethos, he still tries to hold on to like that psychedelic and ethereal aspects of existence. But it's just like the way he tries to synthesize that with his more like reasoned or understood or like rational ideas is like where it kind of becomes tricky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I'm hoping that C.S. Lewis gets into more of that discussion. He mentions science and religion briefly, like super briefly, like just in one sentence here, and how they're if I remember correctly, how they're both fundamentally like against nationalism as the solution, for example.
Mhm.
But it is the kind of the biggest problem of our time is how a hyper rational atheist um, can give a reason for existence itself, let alone the meaningfulness that comes out of an aesthetic experience and art. Just two examples off the top of my head that point to some sort of higher intelligence, and the opportunity for growth spiritually to a higher state of consciousness.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would say there's a reason why Sam Harris and other new atheists turn to Eastern spirituality for some sort of meaning, because I mean, if you think about Buddhism, Zen, Taoism, these things don't necessarily need a god or need a creator.
Mhm.
And so I guess I don't know. I don't know if that'll be fulfilling enough for people,
Mhm.
for atheist types, but I don't know.
Well, this is something that Noah and I got into before the stream yesterday. As we were kind of discussing those Eastern religions and how they have vehicles to alter consciousness. Where in Christian churches, there's typically a lot of emphasis on the ritual aspect of it, where in Eastern practices, there's a lot more emphasis on meditation, chanting, hatha yoga, that sort of thing to alter those states. And going back to
Mhm.
someone like Sam Harris, who's not only written about mystical experiences in terms of for example, like MDMA use, who has had experiences where through meditation he's been able to shut off the circuits in his brain responsible for the sense of self, and how that's going back again to birth of tragedy, that collapse into the primordial unity, as Nietzsche would put it,
Mhm.
and to attribute that the fact that you obviously can have an experience like that, without taking into account the idea of a higher intelligence designing an aesthetic experience,
Mhm.
which incorporates meaning, is like, that's a very hard nut to crack. I don't think you can do that.
Mhm.
Yeah, it seems like I was just having a conversation about this with some friends last night who are very, very rational, scientific types,
Mhm.
both atheists. And it seems like I was trying to make a case for the aesthetic experience, and not underselling the aesthetic experience of living, and um,
Mhm.
all of these different ways of perceiving reality and experiencing. And they're into the neuroscience and physics and everything, which we can use to describe sort of under the hood of the vehicle maybe what's happening. But I don't know. We have to find the language to use when talking about this. The best thing I came up with in the moment was, you can understand all the parts of a car, and you can understand the construction of a car and take it apart and put it all back together. But at the end of the day, uh, that doesn't really describe what it means for a car to be in motion, what it really means for a car to move. Because what it really means for a car to move, yes, all of that is part of it, but there's a gestalt. And I feel
Mhm.
like maybe, I don't know, we have to make that bridge somehow between the scientific mechanisms and this
Well,
experience, which is so rich.
and that's the thing. Even in like Eastern philosophy, I mean, it's pretty commonly said that that won't happen. Like we won't find that bridge because as soon as you, like language, for example, as soon as you label something, that label is inherently not the thing. Um, And
That was
so,
in the beginning of the Tao Te Ching.
yeah, exactly. And so, like a beautiful example of this, I really love this example. It's a Bruce Lee film. I forget the exact film, but he like points at the moon and he says, "It's like a finger pointing at the moon. Don't stare at the moon. Don't stare at the finger, otherwise you'll miss out on all that heavenly glory." And it like pans to the moon. And it kind of describes what you're talking about. It's we will never have a true way of labeling our experience because the only way to truly get that message across is to have someone share that experience. And even in sharing it, you're not going to hit the exact same message out of it. Um, Experience is totally unique to everyone, and there's commonalities between them, but that's kind of where language fits, is where we can kind of agree on a commonality. But uh, as soon as you agree to that commonality, you've essentially kind of corrupted the image slightly in order to like tack that on there.
It's
Um,
the it's like the principle of balance between commonality and idiosyncrasy. Idiosyncrasy.
mm,
There's, yeah, like there's overarching principles that we can all adhere to and understand and commune together under those principles, while at the same time they're not necessarily they don't necessarily adhere to like the absolute individual.
mhm,
There's like nuance there. You know, the devil's in the details.
mhm,
Uh, but I think that what Luke was saying and what you were just saying in regards to things that um, like that principle of the thing that is labeled is it's a priori to where it's like it evades that label in some manner. Uh, Lewis in this book talks about the concepts that imitate nearness to God, and the second one of which he posits is nearness of approach, which I think is really cool because I learned this from Jordan Peterson, where we're wired neurologically in the approach of things, in the pursuit of things, and it's the same principle with Carl Jung. It's that it's never achieving that individuation that is fulfillment. It's the process of coming to better know oneself, and to that is where the nearness to God is found, not in actual like in the actual um, becoming next to God.
mhm,
Yeah, I read somewhere online a discourse between Carl Jung and someone attending one of his lectures, where she asked him if he believed in God, and he was like, he didn't even like feel the need to like go in depth into the explanation of like why that isn't even the right question to ask. What he expressed was his experience of being gripped by something pulling him along, and he's like,
mm,
that's all you need, man.
mm,
And yeah, going back to what you were talking about, I got really excited when I read C.S. Lewis write about approaching God, like as if God's like a destination. And he writes his final union with God, vision of God, and enjoyment of God. And
mm,
I underlined union with God.
mm,
That's not hear a lot of Christians talk about. I've been reading a Meister Eckhart book, and Meister Eckhart was a Christian mystic a long, long time ago. And a mystic is someone who, uh, just phrasing the definition, through contemplation, self surrender, and through contemplation and self surrender, believes that they can obtain unity and absorption into the deity. And it's like that's such a
mhm,
profound idea. It's a similar idea to, like, I guess the end point of the process of individuation, or in Christian terms, the end point of like unity with Christ, becoming a son of God. It's really cool when you start to hear a really philosophical Christian start to speak that way.
mm,
Because I think a lot of the time Christianity like lacks that process of self development that we all crave.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Well, so I find it really interesting the analogy that he chose. So in describing the two nearnesses, it was nearness by likeness and nearness of approach. And so he labels nearness by likeness, like you're on a walk and you stop at a cliff that overhangs a town. And so that would be nearness by likeness because you're proximally closer to the town. Where nearness by approach is you may have to walk back 5 miles to then continue on towards the town. Um, so you may be proximally further from the town, but if you're talking about your route, you're closer.
Yeah,
Um,
that's like
it's
you speaking about it, it's almost like a circumambulation. That's like
exactly.
it's like the maze. You're there, but then it can take you. It just takes you wherever it's guiding you, and then it's like that process of the highs and the lows, swaying between the
Mhm.
imbalances that the process takes place, and that is the process. That is the nearness by approach. That's like what I think he's talking about. So it was
Yeah.
just funny. You saying that out loud kind of sparked that. That was interesting.
Well, so what I find is really interesting is if you kind of keep playing that out, or keep reading, he says he compares nearness by likeness to gift love, and then he compares nearness by nearness of approach to need love. And I find that really interesting because if you kind of put that back into the context of the analogy, if you spend all of your time in gift love, so if you spend all of your time at the top of that cliff, eventually you're going to run out of supplies. You're going to starve.
Mhm.
It's only by walking away and kind of going to the darker parts and then approaching the town again that you then get more of a sense of fulfillment and you're not going to starve. It's a better kind of long-term goal, which in
Yeah.
a way that kind of rings true with gift love because it's good to do. It's good to partake in gift love. It's good to partake in charity. It's good to partake in protection of others, but you have to weigh that against kind of your long-term outcome, which is actually something that he kind of talks about because he compares gift love, or he says that it's a god and a demon. Um,
Hmm.
and I find that to be like a really interesting uh, statement because,
Yeah.
well, no, sorry, I think I butchered that. He says, when it becomes a god, it also becomes a demon.
The quote
Um,
says, yeah, the quote says, "The love becomes demon the moment it becomes a god."
exactly. Um, and so as soon as you take that gift love and put it in the highest place, it becomes a demon. So you treat it as if it's a god. You put it in the highest position, but it becomes something that effectively turns you into a puppet, um,
Well,
and
then it
acts as a demon.
pleasure, right? Like it becomes that need pleasure. Like you become addicted to that love almost.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of an example. So, for
Well,
example, charity. I think charity. We would generally agree that charity is a good thing. But if you make charity your highest value, at some point down the chain, it will corrupt you, and you will perform acts of charity not necessarily for the charity, uh, but out of a sense of vanity.
Hmm.
yeah, it's like
Oh,
it was kind of what Nietzsche was like. One of the things he disdained about like the Christian, or just I guess the concept of like overt charity über alles, where it's
Mm,
kind of like a constant self-sacrifice, and you said there's a vanity in that where you esteem yourself as over others because of your self-sacrifice, when that's really like that's not the most optimal path for you or for those around you, because um, you know I think it was, what was it, it was like Jordan Peterson gave this example, and this may not graft on entirely correctly, but he's like, this concept where not in every situation is like charity beneficial, because if you say you have like $100 and you have like 1,000 people around you who are just absolute, or 1,000,000 people around you who are just absolutely impoverished, he says, well, the first thing you're going to do is run, because if you try and divvy up that expense all around, then everyone's going to be worse off. And so it's like, so yeah, it's just, kind of just wanting to illustrate that. And this is just tough for me because I'm trying to, and we'll get to this more when we get to like the love of God, when we get to agape love, which is the last chapter. Uh, just that kind of where the balance is in that, and how can that best be expressed in accordance to like a instinct for like life and greatness.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, and that's the thing is you kind of have to focus on the positive and the negative aspects, which I think Lewis does a really good job of this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, to kind of expound on your example, like selfishness, Nietzsche didn't necessarily have a negative view towards selfishness. He did recognize that there were negative forms of selfishness, but as an overall kind of concept, you could be selfish and still be virtuous. Um, because selfishness is effectively, in a healthy sense, is more self self preservance.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily about being gluttonous
Yeah.
or greedy. Um, and in that sense, selfishness would be healthy if you're not being like greedy or gluttonous, and you're doing what's best for you, and in a sense, doing what's best for you also does the best for others in the
Yeah.
long term.
I don't know why, but this like reminds me of like an apocalyptic scenario, like say like The Walking Dead or something, where like a loved one or someone like a close friend has become infected, and
Mm.
like in a matter to save yourself and the whole community you're with like an incoming horde of zombies, you killing killing them off is selfish, it would seem, but it is still like it would be better, I would say, than because it's like a certain self-preservation, which I mean, easier said than done, obviously, if you were in that scenario. But I guess that's like that's just something that came to my mind.
Yeah, but I think that I really enjoy the fact that Lewis focuses on the negative aspects of love as well. Namely, like kind of the with gift love, if it becomes a god, it also becomes a demon. And then with need love, kind of the tendency for it to devolve into an addiction of sorts.
So
Because go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
can we stay on the uh, with the gift love? If it becomes a god, it becomes a demon.
Mm-hmm.
You were saying that with charity. So I guess what's the alternative? What's the alternative to that? To avoid it becoming a demon.
Um, I mean, it's keeping it all in check. It's being what's the word? Everything in moderation. You can be charitable, but make sure that you monitor yourself so that when you're being charitable, you're not doing it out of some corrupted sense of vanity. You're doing it out of actual charity. Um, it's kind of like the idea where in the scriptures Jesus says to pray in private. It's it's not that he wants you to never pray in public. It's that he wants you to kind of disavow that sense of vanity. You don't want to pray in public in order that other people recognize that and attribute some type of or ascribe some type of higher value to you because of it. It's not like in
It's
that way. It's very vain. You're not actually praying to pray to God. You're praying in order that you gain some kind of social status. In that sense, it's like a
interesting.
corrupted. What's that?
No, that's interesting. So I wonder what you guys think when it comes to, say, praying, praying in public, um, and avoiding doing things out of vanity, avoiding doing things for status, and being kind of pure.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, and
do
real
you,
quick,
do you think? Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and I don't mean to say that vanity is always a bad thing. There are times where vanity is needed. I mean, um, I think the obvious place for that would be in like selecting a mate. Like you have to be vain. You have to present yourself. It's about appearances. It's about making yourself more attractive. In that sense, vanity is not necessarily a negative quality. Um, like peacocking,
Well,
for example. If you take it too far, sure, it can be negative.
yeah.
But it's again, it's everything in moderation. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your question. I just wanted to.
Well, no, I feel like that what you just said adds some complications, and maybe we could, maybe there would be a conversation about like the types of vanity, you know,
Mhm.
just like the types of love. But do you guys think with this idea of like being pure in your intentions, it's just kind of something you have to gauge with your own, with yourself, with your own soul. Like when you're doing something, if you're thinking, "Ooh, I should give to charity, I should be charitable to this person right now," kind of check with yourself and be like, "Okay, why am I doing this? Why do I want to do this?" And just
Yeah, I
kind of make
mean,
sure, you know.
you
And then
just.
maybe if you're doing it out of vanity, then say, "No, fuck it. I'm not giving him money.
I mean,
I'm not helping him fix his car."
well, so partially. So I think the big thing, the important thing to learn is to watch yourself, to recognize when you're doing that. Um, and I don't necessarily think that that means don't be charitable. If you, I don't think that the argument there would be don't be charitable if you think you're being vain, because I think even C.S. Lewis, within like somewhere in the intro, I think he says, maybe it's the first chapter, he says, um, the acts of a man that is turned to God shouldn't be discounted when he turns away from God. He still did those with the intentions of being a man of God. Um,
Oh wait, I'm sorry. Can you expand
so,
on that? I'm not sure.
so, so, I forget the exact part where it is, but I think it's at the beginning of chapter one. He talks about, uh, I forget the context. The problem is I don't remember the context, but the argument was effectively you shouldn't discount the works of a man while he was, we'll say, under the influence of God. You shouldn't discount those acts after he turns away from God. So, like, for example, if I were to claim that I am a Christian and I go out and perform charity and I go out and do whatever under the proclamation that I am Christian, and then a year later I say, I've had enough of that Christianity stuff. I'm an atheist now. I shouldn't discount the works that I did while I considered myself a Christian. Um, and now that I'm thinking about that, that doesn't necessarily have a bearing on the vanity argument because in that sense, I would have had like a sense of altruism or actual charity while giving charity. Um, so now that I think about it, that doesn't necessarily uh, have that much weight in that argument. Um, I will say, I will say the one thing that the first thing that I said, I think still has weight. The important thing is to learn to watch yourself and try and recognize those tendencies where you turn towards that. Um, I think that's one of the biggest things you can do. And also, if you have the tendency to think that you're doing it out of vanity, then donate anonymously. That's what I do. I don't put my name on like any donations that I put. I always donate anonymously, because I'm not doing it for recognition. I want to do it to give money and like try and help people. So I don't know that if that answers your question. Hopefully it does.
Yes, it does.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So turning back to like that quote of love becomes a demon the moment it becomes a god. He says that in the book. He says that if we ignore it, this quote we said, if we ignore it, the truth that God is love may slyly come to mean for us to converse that love is God. Um, I think that was a very profound point that he makes there, because in the context of C.S. Lewis, um, in the context of Christian belief, you cannot you have to understand love as an intimation, or like it's a product of God. It's not him. It's not God in himself. It's, there's two I guess you could see this in modern culture, specifically with eros love, romantic love. You see this like grandiosity of that form of love, and that's typically what people think of when they think of love now. And you kind of try to esteem that, or like to put that on top of the hierarchy, um, whereas there's even something above that. If you guys could like riff on that as well.
So, oh, go ahead.
Mind it with that quote is in the Bible how it talks about not worshiping false idols. If that resonates with you guys, of like God has given you the experience of love, but then because that is so sweet, you take that and you forget God altogether, and you start worshiping the love that He gave you. And then to forget it's like you find like a well of water, and you have a civilization over here that's dying of thirst. You go and you have like one cup of water, but you forget the well.
Well, I mean, I definitely agree with him here. Like, there is that tendency, especially in the people that consider themselves very altruistic, the tendency to kind of ascribe that love is like the most important ideal. For example, you see this on the left primarily, is that everyone should be respected, everyone's values should be given credence. No values are worth more than any other values, in order that we don't hurt other people. And when I say hurt, I mean hurt in an emotional way, not necessarily a physical way. To hurt people's feelings would be violence in their eyes. And I think that stems from this kind of thinking where love kind of grabs the highest value in their mind. And
Yeah.
so much more than God, because God, in a sense, God can be loving and tyrannous. I mean, he can give, but he can also take. I mean,
It's tough love. He's
exactly.
trying to mold us into Christ.
The idea is that God will punish you if you do wrong. If you think that God is all love, then you kind of you make the assumption that God won't punish you if you do something wrong because He loves you. That's it.
You don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't you don't want to think, you don't want to think about the fact that as much as God is as much as He expresses love towards you, there's also, like you said, that form of tough love, which comes in the form of like punishment, or there's a reason why before Moses and Moses and the Israelites could enter into the Promised Land, they first had to be exiled into the desert, and that's something that's like an archetypal theme almost, where in order to ascend yourself, you first have to like you have to banish and exile yourself from all of these previous ways of life, and that's daunting and it's like frightful. I'm reading a book by a psychotherapist named Alexander Lowen, and he talks about something similar to this. He's talking about um, certain like schizoid individuals, or like now they possess these like schizophrenic qualities almost. They're pretty much just neuroses, but he riffs on an idea about that too, where he'll see the patient kind of descend into this like lower state before they can like address that properly, their problems properly, and to move on.
Hmm.
Yes. Yeah.
I think it's funny because to make the assumption that like love is God is along the same line of fallacy that Jesus was like a hippie, for example. That Jesus was just this
Mm.
super passive pushover, like you ask of me and I will give it to you type person,
Yeah.
which was not the case. Um, which like the example that comes to mind is uh, Jesus was walking through a town and a woman, I think it was a Gentile woman, walks up to him and uh, asks for him to heal her daughter. Um, and he says that like you're not of my people. Why should I help you? And she says that uh, even the dog should be allowed to eat the scraps of the people that have discarded them off the table. And Jesus heals her daughter because he's like, through your faith, your daughter has been healed. Um,
Hmm.
that I don't know if I would necessarily call that love. That's kind of like I don't even know if you can label that tough love.
Yeah, that's it. That's an interesting story of Christ. What do you know by chance, like which gospel that would be in, or
I believe it was in Matthew. I don't remember
Mm.
where. I can look that up later.
okay. Yeah, because that
It's
would
in
be that.
Matthew.
That would, yeah, I'd like to read more into that. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, you're right. That's an example of like he's not, like you said, he's not all passivity.
Mm,
Um, he's not
Mm.
all, when people read the the Sermon on the Mount where he talks about not worrying for the Lord, the Lord, um, he'll watch over you and he'll provide for you. Um, he talks about in the end of that he talks about how, but seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, which which when you put that in context with the previous passage, it's um, this is the most important thing, and you should understand that this pursuit compared to everything else is it's not worth it.
mm,
Mm.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to what we were discussing earlier. I can't really remember the context, but the discussion about satiating our carnal desires that like nature has given to us. You know,
mm.
like the food, the water, the sex, and
So like the need
the
pleasures,
things. What?
like the need pleasures, like thirst and hunger and all of those.
Yeah, that it's like it's that Sermon on the Mount that you just shared that totally reframes that to being like, yeah, that's there, but there's a new way of being that you have once you realize the aspect of yourself that has nothing to do with the material world and the way that nature has set things up.
Mm. It's the idea that like there are things that are more important than hunger, and
Mhm.
that's a hard thing to like wrap your head around because like
Well, there's so much talk of fasting in spiritual circles,
yeah.
and there's so much talk of chastity and
Mm,
everything along those lines of put down your animal nature and ascend to the new way of being, which is you're a son of God and
mm.
capable of moving towards Jesus.
Well, and I don't know because like so I agree with part of that. I agree with like the idea that you should grow the part of yourself that kind of approaches God. I don't necessarily know if that means that you should cut out your animal nature. Um, it's not necessarily it's kind of like the Jungian idea. It's not necessarily that you want to kill off your lust. You want to integrate it and make it healthy.
Mhm.
Well,
Because like a healthy person does have lust for their spouse, for example.
right.
Maybe not in lust, but they do feel sexual desire.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
But a monk per se isn't allowed to get married and
That's true.
exercise chastity. And Jesus was, obviously didn't in any of that, and he spent like what was it, like 40 days fasting, and
Yeah,
the
in the desert.
of it where. Yeah, I think that I would agree with you on a personal level, but in the discussion of Christianity, the framework is ascension away from animal and carnal, the animal and carnal framework into a higher mode of being.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
Well, I guess if you are a uh, if you do like the psychoanalytic sort of viewpoint, um,
mhm,
you could say that you are sublimating. You are
mhm,
sublimating those lower desires into higher desires. And so maybe your very low carnal lust starts to move up into maybe like an artistic sort of love, and then maybe it moves up into like a spiritual ecstasy or something like that. If that's really how these things work. Um, but like, yeah, it's just an idea.
Yeah.
uh,
Going back to what Landon, the example Landon gave of, with monks practicing chastity and like yeah, with Jesus fasting and like a fasting. I don't know because I've heard people take it fasting as either being like a denial of the body, but I've also heard it to be, and I believe this is like a more like it's a grounding in the body. So,
mm,
but even more on like the sexual energy, like the libido that you were talking about, Luke. Um,
mhm.
yeah, it's like that. It's that idea of integrating sexual desire in like a healthy way, but it's not expressed in like a carnal fashion. I'm not saying that that's
Mm.
you know, it's it's not that you've denuded the carnal desire, but that you've like transmuted it. If you believe in like that
Mm.
principle of transmutation, which I think could be applied to the story of Christ.
Well,
But
and that's the thing is I don't necessarily think that Christ fast in the desert. I don't think that that's necessarily about the denial of like of hunger.
mhm.
That's that's more along the lines of like of the idea that man shall not live on bread alone.
Yeah, and I agree with you there.
It's not necessarily about denying your animalistic tendencies. It's about uh, dealing with those animalistic tendencies while also struggling to find a uh, I don't really know what you would call it, like a spiritual high road or a spiritual calling
Hmm.
or some kind of link to a higher power.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, and I don't know. I don't want to call monks like misguided by being chaste because like to each their own.
I
But
think I'm listening.
what's that?
I don't think they're listening. They won't care,
Fair
man.
enough. Fair enough. But well, and that's the thing is like I don't necessarily think it's misguided because again, to each their own. But I don't think that God necessarily calls for chastity.
Hmm.
I mean, obviously he doesn't. Otherwise, I mean, if you make the argument that you have to procreate, you can't be chaste. I mean,
Yeah.
if he wanted you to be chaste, he wouldn't have designed it in such a way that you have to procreate. Um,
Yeah, it's that like certain, certain people can pursue that like that chaste lifestyle, and taking it like something like being a monk. But yeah, that may be it may be that's the exception and not the rule because the exception are the like the artists who can harness that energy into something like powerful and um, expressive, but not in a sexually expressive way.
mm,
But again, that would be the exception, not the rule, because although, and this is a different topic, but although people can have their like each person can have a certain intimation of like an artistic ability in them. That there's a hierarchy with that. So again,
Well, and like, not to be a dick, but you repress your sexuality like that, and then you wind up touching little boys.
yeah,
um,
I think we have to give that some credence,
so
considering the pattern throughout history. I say.
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't get me wrong. I'm all for God, and I'm all for the praising of God. I don't necessarily think He calls for your chastity.
Hmm.
Anyways, I think we've kind of strayed a little bit from the text.
Yeah, it always moves to sex. That's
Yeah.
a law of human nature.
Hey, Freud,
it's a very Freudian way of looking at things.
Yeah. Let's see. What's the next like? Um, so he does kind of talk about the idea of. Uh, so I think maybe we could move on to the pleasures. Um, so you have like the need pleasure, and then you have the uh, appreciation pleasure. And the need pleasure, like we were saying earlier, would be effectively dealing with hunger, dealing with thirst, dealing with sexual feelings. Um, it's I think the way he described it was you have a thought beforehand, and then you act out that thought, and that act gives you pleasure. Whereas appreciative pleasure, you don't have forethought of it. It's kind of like an onset of pleasure. Um, it kind of catches you off guard in that sense.
Mhm. Well, this was something that it was interesting to me, and I would love to hear what you guys think about this. Is that uh, I don't, or uh, he tries to dissociate, or I guess to classify these two pleasures in like existing in different things entirely. Whereas I kind of saw it as perhaps like need pleasures and pleasures of appreciation can exist in all things, but it's a matter of like how it is it's like your mind state almost, like your perception of that thing. Because he uses like say if he takes something like drinking water as being a need pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
If say you're in a mountain stream and you're parched and you drink of this water, or even you may not even press your heart, but perhaps the pleasure of like I can imagine where you appreciate like the nourishing aspect and like the fulfilling aspect of water. But yeah, I'd like to hear you guys' thoughts about that.
Well, so he does, if I understood what you're saying correctly, he does kind of make the argument that certain acts can fulfill both types of pleasure. So, along the lines of your example, it's like drinking a beer. So, like one idea is uh, you, I don't know, you do something and you think, oh, I want a beer, and you go grab the beer, you drink it, and it tastes good, and you like it. The alternative, and that would be like a need pleasure, because you thought, I want a beer, went and got a beer, then you had pleasure. That's the need pleasure. The alternative to that would be, say for example, you were doing yard work or something, and your wife, you finished for the day, and you're just sitting there like watching, like looking at your yard, and your wife walks up to you and hands you a beer. You didn't think like, oh, I wanted that beer, but you drink the beer, and you're like, oh, this is fantastic.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
So
yeah,
you,
I guess
you didn't necessarily have the forethought to say, oh, I want a beer,
yeah.
but it was kind of thrust on you by some external force, and you still appreciate it. You still
Yeah.
derive pleasure from it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I can see that.
yeah, and with that, you could. I don't know if you guys will like resonate with this, but it's that desire seems to come almost from a different place than the actual enjoyment. It comes from that like a slight addiction, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, are you talking about need pleasure or appreciative pleasure is like the addictive?
Yeah, need pleasure. But well, as
Yeah.
the appreciation pleasure is like uh It is just, yeah, it's just looking at my notes, it's the experience of beauty and the sensual and the aesthetic of there wasn't like you don't necessarily like go like desire to look at art in the same way that you desire to drink coffee or to drink beer,
Yeah.
or quench your thirst. You still desire it, but it doesn't come from that same like pang of like I need that right now.
Hmm. Well, and he says that if you try and like force appreciative pleasure, over time it will stop. So the example he gives, I think, was walking into a beautiful garden. If you think that you're going to derive pleasure from that every time you walk into that garden, over time the pleasure will diminish until you eventually don't feel pleasure from walking through the garden. Um, Unless you're like a child, for example, and then in which case, uh, sure, you may feel pleasure every time.
Yeah, yeah. He wrote something in his book Mere Christianity. He talks about this concept of health, and he relates it to man, like he relates it to your worldview in terms of like seeking the kingdom of heaven. He talks about with health, if you become so entranced and so like ensconced in one thing or a certain aspect of your health, then it deteriorates. You like pathologize it because you're like constantly worrying about this one thing and like the overall because health is such a it's synthesized of so many different aspects of your life that if you focus on like one domain of it, then other aspects will suffer. But if you strive for something above that or strive for like the general premise of health, then this like if you strive this overarching value, then these things will manifest themselves naturally. So like in the garden example, he talks about you don't go in the garden to like when you go into the garden to pray to God, then the beauty will like of nature will enrich the experience. But
Mm-hmm.
it's not like um, you're not deriving meaning from nature. Not meaning in like meaning. I mean meaning in a um, like a knowledge sense
Mm-hmm.
because he talks about how knowledge isn't a teacher, but it is like an enrichment of life. If that makes sense.
Hmm.
Yeah.
uh like meaning and like an aesthetic experience, I think in the same way as love comes from God, like God gives that to you, whereas pleasure kind of comes from satiation of your more carnal desires.
Well, I think satiation can come from it comes from God as well, given that He's your creator. But it
Yeah.
is it's like a matter of um, the pleasures. I mean, these are love as well, but it's like there's a shadow form in both. There's it's a matter of um, properly integrating like a need pleasure with appreciative pleasure, and even more so associating like the pleasures, which is like the low form of love, is what he talks about, and these higher forms of love that he talks about later.
Mm.
So, uh,
Um, let's see. So I thought it was interesting that he made the distinction that we typically speak about need pleasures in the past, while appreciative pleasures we speak about in like present tense.
yeah,
Um, I found that pretty interesting. Um, so the example he gave was if you drank something if you were really tired and you drank a glass of water, you'd say like, "Oh, I really wanted that." Versus if you have a really nice glass of wine, but you're not particularly thirsty, you would say something like, "Man, this is a great glass of wine." Um,
yeah.
I find that to be pretty interesting. Um,
Yeah. Why? I mean, what were your thoughts on that?
I
On
mean,
why? Like,
it's not necessarily that it says anything uh, that I didn't already know. It's just one of those things that when you point it out and you see it, you're like, oh, huh, yeah, I guess
yeah,
that's true.
it kind of helps you with like a discerning in your own life. Um, those
Mm,
two types of pleasures, and so you can kind of like catch yourself and kind of assess things from there.
Mhm. I mean, he does actually kind of expound on it with a quote from Shakespeare that I'll be honest, I don't quite fully get what he means by it. Um, I know he's trying to make a point. I just don't quite understand it. So the quote was, "Past reason hunted, and no sooner had, past reason hated."
Yeah, I read that too. With yeah, like I didn't totally grasp what he's saying there, but um, I can see the tense of the passage. So I just I went to it as being like again that idea of something in the past, like you refer to something in the past that being a need pleasure, whereas like it's like the experience that differentiates the appreciative pleasure from the need pleasure because like you notice the appreciative pleasure like when you're experiencing it.
hmm let's see. So he does go on, um, and so he uses appreciative pleasure to describe a different type of love, which would be appreciative love. And he kind of breaks that out into nature love. Uh, 1 second, I might have to go walk my dog. Uh, um, but yeah, so if you guys want to kind of talk about that, I'll be right back.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah. So he yeah, looking at what he said. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, like what he was talking about regarding like what it means to be a true nature lover because he talks about how a true nature lover they love he says the moods of time and season and it's more like the spirit that's what he says the spirit of the place that you derive like, your pleasure from or the nature from as opposed to what was I think it's like the landscape of it if that makes any sense it's the emotional it's like the inner emotional reciprocation of like where you may be and like what it represents.
So, so you said as opposed to the landscape, like
Yeah, like as opposed to the physical landscape of it, as opposed
okay,
to like deriving beauty or love of nature from like nature itself, from like physical nature itself, from like a beautiful scene in nature. Um, you see a landscape, and it's not the physical manifestation of it that you find that you're entranced by, but it's like how you register that like psychologically and I guess like the kind of coloring it puts in your psyche. If that
oh,
like
interesting,
yeah,
interesting.
it's kind of like an abstract thing, but I thought it was like I could kind of understand what he was saying, but um, it
So,
gets you out. But it gets you out of like the pagan notion, which he talks about, like of like loving like the woods and like those are the gods of the woods of pagan worship, and he's trying to distinguish that from loving like the physical aspects of nature as opposed to seeing seeing like an intimation of God in nature and seeing I don't know seeing beyond the landscape. If I don't know if that makes any sense.
I
Yeah.
go ahead.
What I got from that chapter might be a little bit different from what you got, just in terms of the of his expression of nature and how that relates to like the appreciation pleasure, where like he's like, yeah, like God made nature, and you
Yeah,
can have amazing experiences of nature, but if you begin to worship nature, you quickly realize that like there's a lot of shortcomings. Like it
yeah,
can't teach that much. And if you look at nature as God, then you won't necessarily derive as much as you should from it.
yeah. I think that was a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I wish I had I wrote the quote down somewhere. He put it really well.
Well, he talks about actually. I'm looking at my notes, and he says that it's kind of that idea of going back to looking to God, and by looking to something beyond nature, we get the fullness of experience that he intends, because he says like we are overwhelmed by nature's beauty when our focus there remains on God. Um, and yeah, it's again like seeing, don't see like nature as God in itself. That's how like the pagans would have, like it's like the pagan view, but understand God as he's the creator of this, and um, this is like his creation, his artwork, and but especially with the case of C.S. Lewis, God being, C.S. Lewis being an intellectual and like a deep studier of philosophy and like intellectual Christianity. He will like his like when he looked to God, it was more looking at seeing him as like the creator, or the creator of consciousness, and like the logos principle of God. It's not seeing him as like seeing him less, or seeing God at playing part or taking creation and making creation, but seeing him as more of like the advancing factor of consciousness. If that like
Yeah. Well, it's a similar idea to what he was talking about when like you don't turn love into your God. God is your God. You don't turn nature into your God. God is your God. Like God created love and God created nature. Don't mistake one for the other. I found the quote that I was talking about where he says, nature cannot satisfy the desires she arouses, nor answer theological questions, nor sanctify us.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
It's almost like nature, as glorious as nature is, we are we are too different from the rest of nature to be satisfied by having her as a god almost. It's like our consciousness makes it so that I don't know, uh maybe we need something other than just nature, because even though we are nature, we've kind of moved beyond her in a way.
Right.
that reminds me of Nietzsche, a quote of Nietzsche's in Twilight of the Idols. He talks about how um, like our greatest unnaturality is our spirituality. That we possess that thing. Like that's the thing that we possess that puts us above all of nature. It's that like we need, like, nature isn't self fulfilling. It only can go so far.
Hmm.
Again, lacking that other half, that aspect of like transcendence.
Well, see, I have a bit of a different view on that because I even consider like human buildings to technically be nature. It's part of our nature.
Yeah.
So my counterexample to you guys would be like an ant hill. Uh, Ant hills are technically manufactured by ants, but they are part of nature.
Yep.
And in the same way, our houses, however mechanical or artificial they may be, are still part of nature.
Yes, technically, but I guess the point is like we perceive ourselves as separate from nature.
I
And
agree that we perceive ourselves as different
Yeah.
from
yeah,
nature, but
I guess that's
yeah,
kind of what I'm saying, where our God has to match, um has to fit that. Like yes, technically like we're still nature, you know. Um and everything we've ever done has been natural in that sense. But like I think for our psychology maybe we
I
need
mean,
a
I don't necessarily think that God has to be like unnatural or like a conception of God has to be unnatural. I mean, excuse me. I think some people's visions of God would be kind of like that unnatural form that you're talking about, but like,
Well, so I think we need to like define really like the words that we're talking about. God as unnatural, meaning God separate from nature, or
Okay.
as a natural predisposition, I guess. Like we need to specify I think we're talking about two different things here.
Yeah, because and
But
this is the way I read. Like I read that quote from I was talking about that quote from Nietzsche. He talks about spirituality being like our greatest unnaturality because spirituality is the thing that we possess like intrinsically that doesn't seem to manifest itself anywhere else in the animal or plant kingdom.
Mhm.
And with our like evolution of consciousness and with our like our need for like a transcendence, our need for art and beauty, um, it's it's something that's stand like help make or it makes us stand separate from the rest of nature because like with our intellect and with our reasoning capacities we are unnatural because we are not totally instinctual anymore. We're not totally based in like our pleasures. We're
Hmm.
not based in that need for um, like just a basic will to life, like this the will, like an absolute will to power, where we need more than that. And that's kind of what I meant by unnatural, in that we're now we
so
are separate from nature.
going back to what James was saying about the anthill, like yes, the creation of the anthill is a natural thing, but the ants don't get cancer from the carcinogens that the anthill creates, right? So
Well, I
like
mean, that's
it's from
slightly different though, because
Yeah, it's more like
I
I
mean,
understand.
that's just
Oh,
a
go ahead.
lucky coincidence.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, I understand your analogy, James, that um, in the same manner that we construct these civilizations, the same way we construct civilizations as much as like an ant would.
it's our instinct to build civilizations.
Right. And
our
we're societal creatures, but
Mm.
there's something that is unnatural in us, and that is our like affinity
Like free
for
will.
yeah, it's our like affinity for things beyond like basic and like the
Mm.
basic carnal pleasures and the basic um and just the manifestations of like just as an animal would live. It's that's kind of also where the idea of like sin arises from was born from Lucifer in his head, because like an animal isn't sinful because they don't have consciousness in the same way that we do. They don't,
Yeah.
like, they're not self-conscious in the same way that we are. So
It
I don't know. I mean,
language. Language. It honestly might boil down to language. To be honest, um, verbal behavior versus just. I'm in a class about behaviorism and psychology. Verbal behavior versus simple, uh, just very simple, basic types of behavioral conditioning.
hmm.
Um, we have this additional component of language, which adds an extreme amount of complexity to our behavior. Um,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. I think we kind of strayed from the point a little bit. So like getting back into like wrapping this back up into kind of where the conversation and if I can do this in like a nice bundle is the like the return from civilization into nature can elicit a an aesthetic experience of it. I would argue would be similar to a love of God, because you're enjoying the creation that love has or that God has created, and you love that nature. Um,
Mm. Well, see,
uh, yeah, go ahead.
sorry, and so, and this is why I kind of disagree slightly, because in this sense,
With
even
me,
even even the city could be considered nature, because he says it is the moods or the spirit that matters. So
yeah,
it's like the essence of where you are that matters, not necessarily the fact that you're like in the woods, for example. It's just those, like being in the woods typically elicits a type of mood. You can
Uh,
still feel that same kind of sense of grandeur in a city. It's just you typically don't because you're so used to it.
I see.
Yeah.
Um,
So it's just some sort of appreciation of God's creation, which
Mhm.
includes
well,
might include uh, things that seem artificial to us, but are still
so
part of that creation.
yes, in a general sense, because he says that it's not one particular thing. So he says that it's like the appreciative pleasure would be you look at a tree and it gives you pleasure. Like natural love isn't necessarily that you look at a tree and you feel love for the tree. It's the general area that you're in gives you a feeling. You can kind of feel, you can feel like the essence of where you are, if that makes
Mhm.
sense. It's like um,
That's
it's hard to think of examples because it is so specific to like a place.
it's like
Um,
it's like it's like the
Well,
feeling of
this
New
is
York City or something like that. Like or different cities have feelings. Is that kind of what you mean?
yeah,
The
kind of.
but this is like the kind of and I'm still kind of confused as to where like the contention is where like between us, but like I'm talking about like the principle of like take the principle of metaphysics. Do you think that that is present in anywhere else in like in existence as like other than human experience?
You mean
mm,
like the application of metaphysics or like the talking about metaphysics?
the
The
experience
because
of
you could
that.
I would say that animals can probably experience metaphysics. There's no reason why an animal couldn't have an experience with God. Um,
But see,
maybe not to the same complex, maybe not in the same complex way that we do, but it's still a lower form of that same experience.
Mm,
Um,
the only see, and I can relate this like the only way I could see like there being a an experience with God is that in their consciousness, which I would I would say is like separate from ours. It's they're still in like that Eden state. They're
yeah.
still in unity with God because they like they don't have that capacity, that certain capacity for um, discernment and I don't know for just like self consciousness that we do.
Well, that's the thing is like animals have personalities. Like they're not complex personalities like we have, but they still
Mm-hmm.
feel pleasure. They still feel pain. There's still an asshole sometimes. Like maybe, and this is the thing is sometimes it's us ascribing that to them, but sometimes it is them. Like they are complex creatures um, that we don't fully understand. There's more than likely something going on under the hood that we don't understand, in the same way that we don't understand ourselves. Um, and again, I'm not saying that dogs are going to write the next Bible, but there's nothing to stop a dog from having like a religious experience, if that makes sense. I don't know. It's hard to explain. It's not going to be in the same vein as like a human religious experience.
yeah, I would agree with what Noah said about animals remaining in the Garden of Eden and how that would be. You could think of that as a metaphysical and almost permanent religious experience of union with God's creation for sure. But I'm kind of confused on how we got into this argument of the semantics of
Yeah.
animal.
Well, I think it was
It's
because of my contention with the idea that
Oh yeah.
human consciousness is nature, or
Uh-huh.
or human
yeah, not
creations
just
is nature. Sorry,
yeah.
what was that?
I can like yeah, you saying it like that. I can understand what you're saying, but by the same token, I see a duality in that, and like we stand, like there is that, like that's like the motif of science, is that we stand separate from nature, we dominate nature, like we stand over nature because
Well,
we
no,
can
we know the
discern it.
rules. Well, we think we know the rules. That doesn't make us separate from them. We can't act outside the rules of nature. We can think that we can try, but we
Yeah.
can't.
We can.
But like it's like that principle of logos, that we have a principle like a logos, a ordering factor, we have the ability to establish something like the scientific method, that in such a way that it's like the principle of mathematics. We have like an ability, or at least say like an intimation of like a way of
Well, I mean,
trying to like model the universe.
well, we can observe the world in a way different than other animals can. That doesn't necessarily mean that that observation isn't part of nature, though.
Yeah. Okay. So this is one of those conversations where this is like the free will conversation, right?
Yeah.
Because you could say like, oh well, we can determine your actions a millisecond before you even do it, and then someone will be like, well, it doesn't mean I didn't choose to do it. And I'll be like, no, but you didn't choose to do it, and you just make no headway on the conversation. It's like there's a
Fair
divide.
enough.
There's a divide. We're using different definitions, and so this is one of those things that we're just gonna have to learn to talk about where we all get on the same page. But it's so difficult to cross that barrier
I
because,
Yeah.
think.
because yes, we're always a part of like nature because nature is
Yes.
all of this, right? But at
Well,
the same
so
time, like we all know that human beings are not entire. Like there is something that makes us kind of unique, even within nature. Uh, to the but it's hard to kind of grasp this idea. This
yeah.
I think
concept.
for the
Yeah.
time being in this book, we should just use the lens of Christianity as kind of in order to be on the same page while discussing Christian ideas through the eyes of C.S. Lewis, just so we don't get wrapped up in the philosophical discussions that stray from the text.
When you
Yeah.
say like look at it through the Christian lens, you mean like viewing nature as like as a lens to glimpse God, and not seeing God himself, but seeing like his creation, his manifestation, but not his entire manifestation. Is that what you mean?
Right. God as the creator outside of the universe. He stands separate from it and creates it, right? And so,
Mhm.
as opposed to worshiping the creation itself, we worship God. The creation being nature. Did that answer your
Yeah.
question?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
this argument. It's like, yeah, you can go forever. Talk.
Yeah.
It's a
I mean,
complex creation God made. We'll leave it at that.
well, yeah. I mean, even in the Christian church, there's contention about that, but we will go with that definition.
Okay.
That God is something separate from nature. um, I mean, but that's the thing. So, yeah, but effectively, I think what he's talking about here is the mood, or like the essence or the spirit of a place. So
Mhm.
you'll go into, I don't know, you'll walk into a garden, and it just feels tranquil. You can hear like the little stream going by. You see all the flowers. It's like a little bridge going over the stream. It just feels very like tranquil. That would be like the mood or the spirit of the place. That would be like you're loving that tranquility. That's what like the nature love would be. You're not
Mhm.
necessarily loving the bridge or the flowers or the stream. Um,
Interesting.
you love it all as a totality because of the aesthetic that it creates. And I guess
The
it doesn't have to be an aesthetic. Go ahead.
I can read the passage that I think puts this into a really good frame is there is a third element in love, no less important than these, which is foreshadowed by our appreciative pleasures. This judgment that the object is very good, this attention, almost homage, offered to it as a kind of debt, this wish that it should be and should continue being what it is, even if we were never to enjoy it, can go out not only to things but to persons. Is that aesthetic experience that ushers you through into the doorway where you can experience love on the other side.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
I think of like when we you James, you showed us music or a song that you spoke of, and it reminded you, or it gave you like a vision, gave you like, so we're talking about when you give like certain feelings associated with like depictions of nature,
Yeah,
or like not just like you said, it could be in a city, but it's like the what's internal, what you evoke, what evokes in you from that.
exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly like hits the nail on the head.
I'm
Right.
sorry, can
But
you repeat that experience that you were talking about?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Can you repeat the experience that Noah was talking about? I don't quite remember.
So I don't remember the exact experience, but in general, when I listen to certain songs or listen to certain types of music, it evokes an image in my head. And it also typically evokes some kind of complex emotion. It's not necessarily like happiness or sadness. It can be like bittersweetness, for example. Um, and it's usually accompanied by some kind of visual imagery. Um, and in that sense, that would be like a natural. I think that would be like the type of nature that he's talking about here. It's like, even though it is like a song, it evokes some kind of mood in me, or it evokes some kind of like strong emotional uh, response that I
Hmm.
enjoy,
Yeah,
and that would be the nature love.
it's almost a religious experience.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think the word homage is a really good um, word that he put in parenthesis. Is like, it's, yeah, you listen to that piece of music and you go, this is very good,
Yeah.
as Lewis would put it. Yeah, I like the example he gives of it is the feeling which would make a man unwilling to deface a great picture, even if he were the last man left alive and himself about to die.
I really like that quote.
Yeah, and it's interesting because um, this distinction between appreciating the like a natural nature itself or a song itself versus what it evokes in you.
Mhm.
What it evokes in you is personal and ephemeral and also impossible to communicate to another person,
Mm-hmm.
except maybe through art. Um, and so it's interesting that more uh, those more precious, uh, loving experiences are the most personal
Mhm.
and the ones that are most difficult to express.
Well,
Yeah,
so
really good way of
yeah.
like we're almost always talking about emotions, like the way that life makes us feel, and not as much uh, our experience through the lens of language, but through the sense of feeling, like visceral gut feelings that we have through aesthetic pleasures and through an experience of life in
Mhm.
general.
Well, so I think a quote from the book that sums this up really nicely is overwhelming gaiety, insupportable grandeur, somber desolation are flung at you. Make what you
Mm-hmm.
can of them, if you must make it all. The only imperative that nature utters is look. listen, attend. I think that
Beautiful.
it's something that takes you out of your head and forces you to focus on the moment.
Yeah, it's like when he talks about when he says it kind of goes along with like nature doesn't. He says nature only teaches you what you've already decided to learn. So it's not, he's saying nature's not a teacher, but it's in like an enricher, and it's like it may not be useful in like one aspect, but it's useful in this aspect of like being encapsulated or like you said, being what's the word? Yeah, encapsulated by nature. It's not like it's not teaching you anything knowledge wise, but it's like a intuitive or experiential knowledge.
Hmm.
So,
So he kind of goes on from nature. I don't know if you guys have anything more to speak about, like nature love. I figured we might kind of bridge into patriotism.
mm-hmm.
Because he goes on to talk about patriotism. And it's weird because he has kind of a mixed opinion. I think he definitely sees some negative aspects of patriotism, but he also focuses on some positive aspects.
Yeah.
So, for example, so he talks about like patriotism can kind of be uh, roughly the same type of love as like the love of your first home. So it's like the love of where you grew up. It's like effectively a sense of nostalgia, the love of old acquaintances, familiar sounds and smells, and then like the idea that you can love your country. And it's not necessarily that you love the physical land of the country as much as you love the lifestyle that that like the economic or political system can afford you, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not necessarily that I love the ground that my house is on, but I love the fact that I am sheltered by my house.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I say I love my house, I'm not necessarily talking about the ground that it's on or like the physical walls. It's about the things that it provides me.
Yeah, it's kind of the difference between patriotism and nationalism.
Mm,
And the other aspect is like again going back to um not putting love up as your god, not putting nature up as your god. Don't put your country up as your god. Just what Nietzsche was getting at a lot of the time.
mm-hmm.
The collapse of the Christian ideals and the rise of nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
Just to add on, what you were saying.
It's funny because he very briefly touches on it, but then just says like I'm not going to talk about it any further. Um, like the oh, what's the word? It's not conquest. It's like the religious, like the Christian religious movement in like the 1200s.
Crusades.
The Crusades,
Result?
yes, Crusades. So it's like the idea that that certain land is belong to you due to some divine right,
Mm-hmm.
and then you're willing to kill for it.
Right.
I think he would have considered that to be a very negative use of patriotism.
Mhm. Yeah, C.S. Lewis actually fought in World War One, so I think he probably had a lot to say on the topic.
I didn't know that. But yeah, so he kind of keeps talking about some of the positive things though. So for example, um, like the idea of your country's past. So taking like the hero myths of your country, um, which he also says that can be kind of corrupted. It depends on how it's framed. So if you take like a hero myth and present it as actual factual history, um, it can kind of devolve into uh, uh, what's the word? It's like it can devolve into kind of a negative aspect. Um, it's more along the lines of propaganda in that way,
Mhm.
where if you think of it in the vein of legend, even though it could be factually true, you're less likely to fall into that pit trap.
Yeah, it's like the way. Yeah, he talks about this like the way you perceive history.
Hmm.
He talks about um, you know the perspective of history can be it's pathologized when it becomes when it becomes a systematic study of one's country, of their history of one's country. Then it can easily devolve in like utter cynicism, because he talks about no country can every country has a dark aspects of its past. So I mean it's kind of like it's pessimistic, but it's like something. It's like a claim you don't think about, but it's true. In development of civilization, that's the problem of like large aggregations of people in general. It's that um, what do you do with people who stand outside of the values of that which that country is founded? Then that's like where you see the darkness occur in the past, where um, like groups of people can be murdered, and just there can be general pathologizations of like lust for power, and
Hmm.
it's tricky. But the fact is that you can't get away from that when you're looking at a country.
Yeah, I mean, so I do have one kind of gripe. I think that he is a bit too harsh on nationalism. Um, I don't necessarily think that it is always bad to be nationalistic, to like take pride in one's country. Um, and he kind of goes into it becomes negative when you think that your country is the greatest country in the world. Um,
Yeah.
and I definitely agree that there can be times where that is a negative thing, but I would have to disagree in that I think that it is healthy to think that your country is better than others. Well, I don't think it's unhealthy to think that. Um, so, for example, if I were to say that America is the greatest country that's ever existed on the planet, um, I don't necessarily think that that's not like an unhealthy belief. It may be misguided at sometimes. It may not be. I don't know. Um, but I don't think there's anything implicitly wrong with stating that. And I think that he would make the argument that you shouldn't really say that, or you shouldn't believe that.
Right.
The
And I think there's also ties with like the psychological implications of what it means to be like how do you perceive like your where you've been born, and like how do you perceive your upbringing,
Mm-hmm.
um, whether or not you love something, say like your country, that can be reflected in whether or not you love, say, your familial relationships, and you love the house that you were raised in, or
Mm-hmm.
you disdain it. There's definitely ties, I think, in that. But yeah, like you said, I think there is a balance in that, because it's certain a pride for one's country. To see your country as valuable is like a necessity, and it's a necessity in that. Again, it ties in with like the general premise of having pride in like your heritage, your story, your own like, personal story.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Well, so and the
That doesn't
only
have to, there's no reason that has to come from your national identity though.
yeah,
well,
Your
so
heritage, you know.
I mean, it kind of does, and so the one thing that he does kind of say that in the positive direction towards nationalism is that it can be used as a tool to motivate people without having to ascribe some kind of moral or ethical uh, uh, some kind of like negative moral or ethical reason for attacking or aggressing or defending even. Um, and so the example that he gave, that he said that he wasn't going to go too far into, was like the Crusades. Like Christians have done this. Uh, they've used their kind of Christian identity to motivate people to perform acts that they should not have. Um, and he says that that can be a positive thing, especially especially when compared to that implication of moral or ethical violation. Um, and in that sense, I do kind of agree with him. So, for example, um, I mean, you can see this with how America entered World War II, right? So we we entered World War II and we convinced everyone to join out of a sense of national pride because we had been attacked. We as a nation had been attacked. And so it was up to us to kind of get off the back foot and join the fight.
Right. I think kind of going with what you said, Luke, that I do think that your identity, like the level in which you identify, or the total collection of what your identity is, at some level it does stack up to like a national um, identity. Now, how, like, I'm not saying like you totally adhere to, say, what the current values of that nation is, because it's not obvious that that's always, um, that may not be something that you eternally adhere to, like on the individual level, but you still have some form of national identity because you exist in like an aggregate of a nation.
Mm.
Right. Yeah, it's almost as though it's the discrepancy between putting the nation up as the highest ideal and putting God up as the highest ideal. And from my point of view, what he's getting at is, once that nation's up as the highest ideal, then that's the thing that you're now worshiping.
Mm.
Right. Yeah, you're right. Like the hierarchy of it is a good.
Yeah.
Like
Well,
so yeah, and you could have multiple nations with the same God, and so in that way they can all be unified. And I don't know, my idea of uh, Europe, I guess, is that that's that's how Europe should be. Is that
also,
these many diverse nations are all pointed in one direction towards God.
yeah. Well, so and I agree with the idea that uh, like a nation should be like the value of the nation should be underneath the value of God. I am fully in accordance with that. I fully agree with that. But even if you think of it at the level of nations, so like to say that my nation is better than your nation, in a sense, and I think what he gets at, in a sense, that gives me the right, at least at the very least, maybe not the right, but it gives me the justification uh, to invade you, for example, um, because I'm better than. In that logic, you would be saying like I'm better than you, my nation is better than you. You should submit to my nation and take on our ideals because they are better. So in a sense, there is that justification, like self-justification, not necessarily like an absolute justification. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I don't think that you should take. I don't think that a belief that your nation is greater than other nations justifies like the invasion of another nation. But I don't think that the belief that your nation is greater than other nations is like an implicitly negative thing.
Well, this goes back to what you were saying earlier about like the left in terms of equality and how that relates to love. It, it's kind of it's hard to make the separation between equality and love. But fundamentally, if you put yourself above someone, then it's pretty hard to love them. If I think I'm better than you, then there's not a lot of room for
Well,
love.
I
I
mean,
wouldn't necessarily agree with that because I think we talked about this a few days ago, Landon. Because if you're thinking in terms of like a noble king, a king is above its citizens, but at the same time, um, he has love for them because, well, not maybe not because, but he has an inherent love for his citizens, although they are below him. Um, I don't necessarily think that, even though like on a like I guess like on a national level, like in terms of um, levels of power, or yeah, like hierarchy of power, um, I think that love can still be distributed, but it's not like a love of equality. It's more like a love of, like I guess
Well,
for like a love of
so
providing.
and so
so but if I can finish kind of my discourse with Noah and get my point, um, a better description of my point is that king in the example you gave is materialistically above the citizens. He has more riches and he's better off financially, and that hierarchy has to exist to run a country. But on a spiritual plane, they're all sons of God, and equal under God. You know,
mhm.
it's um and in that on that spiritual plane they're all equal, and that spiritual plane is where love stems from. It's not a material love at all.
I mean, I can think that I'm better than you and still have empathy for you, or
But
even love you.
equality and love.
I mean, just because I don't believe, so I don't think that you have to believe two people are evil to believe that they can love each other. Because I don't believe that people are inherently, I don't believe that people are equal, but I still believe that people love each other.
Yeah.
I guess those are just like our fundamental
Well,
disagreements
well,
between us.
and so I think, so here's my example, and maybe there's a problem with it or maybe not, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. So, for example, the United States. I believe that the United States is the greatest country in the world currently. Maybe not historically, but currently. Um, and an example of how we love other countries is that we are the most charitable country in the world. We give more money than any other country in like the history of the world, to other countries, and every other country hates us. So we're not doing it to get them to like us. We're doing it out of like altruism. That, in a sense, is
Well,
actual love, even though we
I'm
consider
not.
ourselves to be better.
Well, let me say, I'm not sure that's necessarily true that it's happening out of altruism.
I mean, maybe
Might it?
not.
No, listen. Might it not be possible that the reason they hate us is because we made them dependent on us?
I mean, that is possible. I that does have some weight. Um, and yeah,
But
I mean, there's some truth to that.
so this is something that I'm gonna struggle finding the exact words that Jordan Peterson used in that lecture he gave, that it was kind of passed around the Discord a long time ago, but is like I he said like I don't dare say that God exists in that lecture. If you remember that one, he
Mm.
talks about the idea that humans have intrinsic value, and that on our fundamental base level, the fact that we're human um, means that through our humanity we are equal. How that relates to action, and to a hierarchy, I think that's a different discussion between like the base level as humans we're equal to each other.
Well, so, and that's the thing is to kind of get back to that. I believe that people should have equal rights. I believe
Mhm.
that people are equal under the eyes of God. We will all be judged under the eyes of God. As far as equality in like this physical body, we are not equal. Like
What I was
you and
saying.
you and I are better at different things. Like you may be better at one thing than I am, but I may be better at one thing than you are. We're not equal. Um,
Yeah, but
I mean, you can even apply that to like moral systems. Like I can think that I am morally better than you, and I can still like you. Um,
yeah,
I can
yeah.
think that I have a better national identity than you and still like you or love
But
you.
how do you love me if you are superior to me? I think the only way you can is if you think, okay, despite the fact that in this physical world I'm superior to you, I still love you because there's something about you that is uh, that is
Intrinsically,
intrinsically lovable.
yeah.
That's in human beings,
Right.
and that can't be. And that if I'm the most worthless human on the planet, you can't attribute that to anything about me physically or anything I do. It's something beyond the physical world.
Yeah, that was, he said it better than I could in my example. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Thank
I mean, saying how do I want to phrase this? Um, I mean, like, so, hmm. So I guess the counterexample would be that God can love us
Hmm.
and we can love God. I think that God is superior to me, but I love him.
That's
So
what I was gonna.
why can't it go the other way? If I can love someone superior to me, why can't I love someone inferior to me?
That's what I was gonna say, because even on like that, even in terms of like the material hierarchy regarding a king, like in a spiritual hierarchy, there are
Mhm.
humans and there's God, so there's still that. Even there, you don't get out of that aspect of like superiority and inferiority, and it's like a love exchange.
I mean, you
The
could make the
analogy.
argument. Oh, go ahead.
That's where the analogy of like the father and the son comes in, where a child is inferior to a parent in a different way because the parent knows better and the
Mm,
parent got, but the parent would lay down their life in order for their child to go on living. That's like kind of the definition of love right there. So that's what
yeah.
God is to us.
Well, that's
Well, I think that same type of love can be applied to nations. I mean, like I
Yeah.
can think that my nation is better than yours, and still act in a way that helps you like raise yourself out of poverty, for example. Like
Well,
the idea
so
that the US and other Western countries have helped spread capitalism, which has raised more people out of poverty than any other economic system that ever existed.
and still doesn't put them above it. So what if I can finish with that specific
Yeah, go ahead.
analogy how that relates to what you said? It's the parent doesn't have a hierarchy between children. The all children are equal in the eyes of the parent, and it would lay down its life for any of the children.
Okay.
And so, as human beings, we're all children of God. Therefore, we're all equal in the eyes of God, what no matter what our
Mm,
actions are. Like you don't like if one child is 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 angrier and throws tantrums and has less of a moral
1 second, guys. Sorry, my headphones just died. So,
Oh,
go ahead and speak.
hello.
hello.
Perfect. Hopefully, there's no like feedback loop. Um, Unfortunately, my headphones just died. But so I understand that example. I just don't think that that is the only case. I think that you can. I think that you can love your children unequally and still say that you love them.
I guess that would just be like a fundamental thing that we couldn't reconcile between just our individual worldviews.
Yeah.
I
I mean,
I
it's
don't.
not to say that I can't be convinced otherwise, but at this
Okay.
point, we probably shouldn't spend all the time arguing over it.
Yeah.
I would just say that I don't know. I think there's like an equal dispersion of love, but it's like at the level of you have to take into account their personality in which that love is manifested, because you can't apply the same patterns to each children because each of them have their own idiosyncratic development. So, yeah, it's whether it's a question of love, I don't know, but there is they're not inherently equal to each other. If that makes sense.
Well, it's unconditional love versus conditional love, and in the West, something that's typically spoken about in spiritual and psychedelic. Hold on, spiritual and psychological circles is that we're in the West raised with conditional love. We act right, and as a reward, we get love, and that's sort of how you train a child. Whereas on a spiritual plane, in a relationship with God, God gives you unconditional love, and He might punish you in terms of teaching, but the love doesn't go away. He punishes you out of love.
I mean,
if that makes sense.
See, I don't know about that because, I was raised in a household where I was punished for doing bad things. That doesn't necessarily mean that my parents didn't love me.
It's
right.
But
That's what.
What?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, because I don't know if I believe that the West is training people to be conditional lovers.
Oh, well, it's not necessarily about the West. I mean, I think about Chinese Chinese kids who are expected to perform very highly in order to get their parents' approval. Like, I don't know.
It's just the general. I mean, that's why, the love of God in Lewis's terms is gift love. That's what unconditional love is to a human, because gift love is you're not going to be given your human condition, you will not be unconditionally loving. So it's a matter of you choosing to do that, and so that's the love of God, I guess. That's what I understand is that.
Boyos, I gotta bounce. It's been great talking to you.
Yeah, man.
Much love. I'm glad we had this conversation. Until next time.
Yeah, thanks for swinging in, Luke.
Yeah, see you guys.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, I don't think there's really that much left, anyways. So.
Yeah.
Actually, I think that might be a good place to wrap up, unless you guys had more to add in, because he kind of ends on the whole patriotism and nationalism.
Yeah. I guess the main idea that I took from this section is it's an interesting idea of viewing history, because you take history as a science, and you want to break it down to you want to take that scientific approach to understanding past events. But history, while it's also factual events, it's also a story, and in story there's a meaning embedded in that story, and so you have to take that into account with how that registers with people of that nation. And so it's an interesting way of how he advocates for telling of history. It's not necessarily a whole fairy tale, but at the same time, it's not rigorous, factual data and statistics of what had happened in the country's past. And because ultimately he thinks that path will bring, that'll have dark connotations with it, or more negative connotations than good. And the same thing with a fairy tale, because you're not based in reality at all. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think those are good points. I mean, it's kind of the idea, and he kind of says this a lot. It's like the idea of balance. I mean, you kind of have to have enough of it to be a good thing, and then don't go too far. Otherwise, you wind up corrupting it.
Right.
It's like a
God
pretty common
above,
theme.
yeah, that was the main thing that I took away from this is God above any of the creations that God has. You know, the fountain, you get the water above the water. That well is more important than satiating your thirst in the present moment. You got to where it all stems from.
Exactly.
Yeah. Man doesn't live by bread alone.
Yeah, that was chapters, man. That was he a lot of ideas in there. That's a great lens to look at just the spiritual landscape from. It's really stuff.
Yeah.
Also, it was an absolute pleasure to read because I have been feeling like super down in the dumps lately, and like reading this has like really kind of like picked me up a bit.
Yeah.
All you need is love.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's all I have to say on it for right now. Is there any kind of like last wrap up things you want to say before I call the stream?
No, I think we've said it all, or said as much as we could for now.
Okay. There. You guys had a good time. I appreciate the talk.
Yes, thank you.
Later.